Hey, friend, Chris here from LogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. Welcome to day 37 in our Newbie to Ninja series here on the channel and website, where I'll help you go from being a beginner in Logic Pro to become an expert, fully comfortable and capable to get right down to making awesome music in this amazing application. Today, let's finally dig into the live loops grid in Logic Pro. Up until now, everything in our series has revolved around the tracks area, and it kind of makes sense. Most songs and arrangements are made up of individual creative ideas that are put together into parts and arrangements that make up our songs. However, what do you do when you're in the process of generating different creative ideas, but you don't know if these parts necessarily go together quite yet into an arrangement? Well, that's the beauty of the live loops grid. You can just throw your ideas onto the page or sketchpad of the grid and then play around with these different ideas to see how they gel together side by side. Just like the tracks area, the live loops grid is made up of individual tracks that line the grid from top to bottom. There are track headers for each individual track, and each track header functions exactly the same as the tracks area. So for example, we can mute and solo tracks. We can also record enable our tracks, input monitoring enable, adjust levels, panning, and anything else that you can do in the tracks area as well. You can access the channel strip and its controls for each track from the inspector, as well as the mixer. The biggest difference between the live loops grid and the tracks area is that instead of having individual regions that line our different track lanes from left to right in sequential order of how we want different parts to play back in time, we have instead what are called cells. Cells are independent parts that you record, program, or import into the live loops grid that you can then play back on a loop alongside any other cell across the grid. This means that different cells don't have to be directly above or below one another to play back together at the same time. You can begin playback of any cell across the grid just by hovering your mouse over that cell until you see this darkened circle with a play button in the center, and then you just click. As you can see, when I clicked on the cell, it took some time for playback of the space cell to stop. And this is governed by the Quantize start function in the upper right-hand side. Also take note that the time in the LCD hasn't stopped either, so playback is continuing on. It's just this one cell that has stopped playback. So if I press spacebar on my Mac's keyboard, I stop playback for the entire grid. You could also use the play button at the top. And if we press stop, we stop playback for the entire project. So now let's start playback of different cells across the grid and then stop playback for those same cells by clicking on them once again. As you can see, each cell along the grid, regardless of where they live on the grid, began a looped playback. And then each individual cell stopped playback when I clicked once again. And then I stopped playback of the entire project by pressing spacebar on my Mac's keyboard. These are really important details because our different cells are different creative ideas that just are independent and live on their own. And just because we stop playback for one cell doesn't mean we're going to stop playback for all the other cells or the project as a whole. So each track lane is made up of cells from left to right that match that track type. For example, our beats track lane is an audio track type, and it's made up of different audio cell ideas. If we select the first audio cell and go up to the editor button in the control bar and open the editor, we get the audio track editor that provides us with everything from flex to automation, as well as the edit, function, and view menus. If we select a software instrument track type and select a cell, we now have the piano roll that we can use exactly the same as we could in the tracks area. So if we rather move these snare hits up to a snap, we can. And now the cell will play back with snaps instead of the snare. We can also right-click on the MIDI cell and go down to convert and convert this to a pattern cell. Look at that, we now have a pattern loop. May want to adjust this down to perhaps 16 steps. There we go. And if we load a drummer track type, just for the sake of argument, and click create. Look at that. We now have a drummer cell with Gavin playing his Brooklyn kit. So although different cells being directly above or below one another doesn't mean they have to play back at the same time, vertical columns of cells in Logic are known as scenes. So in the event that you want to be able to arrange and play back different cell ideas together as a part, you can. And you can begin playback of that scene by clicking on this hat icon directly above the number or name of your scene. Now, depending on the playback behavior of your scenes, clicking on this hat icon again will either stop playback or re-trigger it or introduce momentary playback. We'll explore these different playback behaviors in just a moment. Okay, so we can click on individual cells to begin playback. We can also click on scenes to begin playback of an entire column of cells. But what if you want to begin playback of different cells across the grid at the same time that are not part of the same scene? Well, we can do this by queuing different cells together. If I select this keyboard cell, and then hold shift, and then click on maybe this beat cell, and let's pick this percussion cell, and perhaps this bass synth cell. If I now either right click on one of the selected cells, you can queue this entire cell selection for playback. Or you can use key command Option and Return. By pressing Option and Return on my Mac's keyboard, I've now dequeued these cells, and by pressing it once again, they're all queued up for playback. If we now press play on one of these cells, all the cells will play back simultaneously. By pressing spacebar on my Mac's keyboard, I've now stopped playback of the grid, but we can see that all these cells are glowing, indicating to us that they're still queued up for playback. So if I begin playback again, they start right back up. If I now queue an additional cell, holding Option, pressing Return, if we now press spacebar, we've now introduced this separate keyboard cell into our playback. And as you may have noticed, the original keyboard cell was deselected, dequeued for playback, and that's because you can only play one cell at a time in a track lane. So in this row right here for the keyboards, I was only able to select this cell or any other cell. It's one or the other in a track lane. So let's do the same thing for the percussion. Let's select this one, Option Return. I've now dequeued this cell right here for playback. And if we press spacebar, this cell plays back with the grid. Okay, at this point, we can dequeue each of these selected cells, either by selecting each one and pressing Option and Return, or we can go right down to the grid stop button in the bottom right-hand corner here and click to stop playback and dequeue everything in the grid. Let's now bring our attention to the Quantize Start in the upper right-hand corner of the Live Loops grid. Quantize Start determines when cells start and stop playback in context of our projects. In this case, Quantize Start is set to 1 bar, so cells won't start or stop their playback until every major bar. But by clicking on the drop-down menu, you can set the Quantize Start to different values. For example, let's customize playback to every 2 bars. Now let's begin playback of some of these cells. Or if we go in the other direction and maybe set this to an 8th note, and let me stop playback of the entire grid, start over. So now cells are starting up their playback much faster than they were before because an 8th note is a shorter duration to wait than 2 bars or a bar. So the Quantize Start in the upper right-hand corner is a global setting for the entire grid. However, you can also set a Quantize Start on a per cell basis. By right-clicking and holding Control and click on a cell, we can go down to Playback and then go down to Quantize Start. And we can set the cell to not follow the global playback, but instead have its own separate Quantize Start function. Or we can right click or hold Control and click on a scene to set the quantize start for an entire scene independently from the global quantize start once again. This brings us to the play mode for our cells and scenes. Take note, when I press play on a particular cell and then press play again, we stop playback of that cell. Playback continues for the entire project until I hit spacebar. Now our cells start and stopped when I clicked on it because a particular play mode was set for that cell to start and stop when clicked upon. And you can see the different play modes for the different cells by opening the inspector. If we go right down here, instead of having a region inspector, we now have a cell inspector. And if we select a cell and go right up here, we have this option for play mode. And if I click on the play mode dropdown, we have 3 options, beginning with start stop. And this is exactly that. When you click on a cell, it begins playback. When you click on the cell again, it stops playback. If we set this to momentary, and let's select something that starts off pretty much immediately, and set the play mode to momentary, from here, playback of the cell will begin the moment we click, but will only last for as long as we're clicking and holding on the cell itself. And now playback has stopped. Let me try it again. But of course, being governed by the quantize start function. So playback of the cell lasts for only as long as I'm holding down on it with my mouse or controller or Logic remote. But again, the cell won't stop playback until it meets that quantize start value that's been globally set for the project, which is 1 bar. So now if we right click or hold Control and click on this cell and go down to playback and set the quantize start maybe to the 16th note and do the same thing again. Playback of the cell stops pretty much immediately. And lastly, we have a play mode of re-trigger. So when we click on the cell will begin playback. If I click on it again, instead of stopping, instead just re-triggers the playback. And to stop playback of a re-triggered cell or scene, we can just press spacebar once again on our Mac's keyboard to stop playback of the entire grid. Or we can click on the stop button right here in the divider on the right-hand side. Or stop the entire grid by clicking on the stop grid button. And yes, you can also set this on a per scene basis. If we hold Control and click or right click, we can set the play mode for the entire scene to start stop, momentary, or re-trigger. Let's give it a try right now. Okay, now that we've gone over a lot of the mechanics of the Live Loops grid, how do you begin to record or import your own creative ideas into your own grid? You can begin inputting or recording any type of idea into the Live Loops grid, whether it's an audio recording, MIDI recording, or by inputting individual notes into the piano roll or step sequencer. For this video, I'm going to record a guitar idea into scene 5 of the grid, and I'm going to record it right into here. So by hovering your mouse over an empty cell in the Live Loops grid, we can see this darkened circle with a record button, and we could either record our idea independently by itself or alongside other queued cells. Because everything in the Live Loops grid revolves around the tempo of our projects, it's a good idea if you're going to record just an idea by itself to record alongside the metronome. So now if we hover our mouse over this cell and then press record, we'll get a count in, and then we can begin recording. Let's also make sure to include software monitoring so we can hear my guitar. And let's do it. All right, so we've now recorded our audio idea into this cell, and now we can listen back to just this cell. Okay, so I didn't intend for that long pause at the end, so let's open the editor for our cell by pressing key command E. All right, and we can turn off flex view for now. And now we can see a waveform view of our cell idea, and we also can see the cell start and stop alongside both boundaries. So we have these triangles at the beginning and end of the waveform view. If we click, hold, and drag on that triangle, we can adjust the length of the cell. So if we take a listen now, okay, so we have some timing issues as well. Let's show hide flex. And let's set this to maybe monophonic. And I want to make sure to quantize this region, maybe to 16th note. So now everything's locked to the grid. Take a listen again. All right, a lot better. But honestly, I'd rather just play along with some of the other cells in the scene. So let's close the editor. And what we're going to do is we're going to select our scene. And we're going to cue the scene. And now I need to record it into the same cell again. And we could choose to either record either in takes or just replace the idea altogether. We'll keep this to takes. I can either right-click to record into the cell, or use key command Option and R to record a new idea into the cell. I'll turn off the click by pressing key command K, and let's give it a try. All right, so playback has stopped. If we open the editor once again, key command E, there we have it. And we can even quantize if we want for this cell. Beautiful. And now, if we stop playback for the entire grid, hover our mouse, we can see we have two different takes for this cell. And we can flip between the two just by clicking with our mouse on the number and flipping between the two. Awesome. But I have another idea that I think I just want to replace all of this with. So I'll set recording to that of replace. I'll cue up the scene once again by either right-clicking or holding Control and click. I'll select my cell, press Option and R. Awesome, so we have our new idea. It's replaced our other two ideas. We hover our mouse, we don't get that number. I'll set the quantize once again to 16th notes. If we take a listen. Beautiful, so I have my idea. It's been recorded into the project and it's part of the scene. And the same can be done for software instrument track types. So we could record into this cell right here if we wanted, just by record enabling. Or we can right-click on an empty cell to create either a MIDI cell or a pattern cell, from which, if we open the editor by using key command E, we can start to input individual steps. And there's our idea laid out in a pattern cell. I'll use Control and Option, and then click, hold, and drag to bring up the magnifying tool, and there's our pattern cell. So I'm just going to get rid of this cell for now and zoom out, Control and Option for the magnifying tool, though we don't see it. There we have it. And of course, we can import Apple loops into the Live Loops grid just by clicking, holding, and dragging into the grid. There we have it. And of course, Apple loops always conform to the tempo of our projects. But additionally, if we go to the Finder, if I bring in this bass loop that plays at 134 BPM, and import it into the live loops grid. Logic is going to analyze the transients and the tempo, and now the bass loop will conform to the tempo of the project. Isn't that something? So if we set this maybe to 50, play it again. As will everything else in the project. As you saw a moment ago with my guitar lead here, I adjusted the end time of the loop as a whole to better fit alongside everything else in the grid, which brings us to details like cell start and cell length, loop start and loop length. And honestly, I think it's just a lot easier to explore what these functions do visually inside an editor. So let's press key Command E, and let's scroll down so we can see this acoustic guitar loop. I'm going to zoom in so we can get a little closer look at what's going on. Okay, within the context of our editor, we should see a timeline at the top, which will show us the bars and beats of our cells. At the very front end of a cell, we have a triangle that notes to us the cell start. And at the end, we have a triangle that lets us know the end of the cell or the cell length. And by clicking and holding on the triangles, we can adjust the cell length. So now we've adjusted this cell to a single bar in length. If we begin playback, cool, so we can get pretty crafty with the cell start and end. We adjust this further out. We've now increased the length of our cell to 2 bars. Take a listen and a look. And that brings us to the cell loop length. This color bar, much like the cycle range in the tracks area, lets us know when the cell's loop will begin and loop 2. So now our cell starts at bar 2 instead of the very front end or beginning of the cell, which started at bar 1. The length of the cell is set to 2 bars at bar 4, but after the second bar, our cell starts to loop starting at bar 3 to bar 4. And from then on out, it just keeps looping that single bar. And all of these changes are reflected in the cell inspector. Cool, so just keep your eyes on the cell inspector here as I change this back to a start of bar 1. Cell length set to a total now of 4 bars. The loop start goes back to bar 1 and a total length of 4 bars again. So a lot of versatility for fine-tuning the playback of your different cells. And also, if you don't want a cell to play back on a loop, you can either click on this colored bar to disable the loop function or click on the checkbox next to loop in the inspector. If we now play back this loop, okay, so you're recording and inputting different creative ideas into the live loops grid. You're testing out how different cells and scenes play off one another as you listen back. And maybe at a certain point, you do arrive at an arrangement that you like. Once you're ready to commit to an arrangement, that's a good time to transition from the live loops grid over to the tracks area. Now you can both show and hide both the live loops grid and the tracks area just by clicking on these buttons right above the main area of your projects. The button on the left-hand side is to show or hide the live loops grid. So by clicking on this button, we flip the view from the grid over to the tracks area. Once again, if we click now on the tracks area button, we flip back to the live loops grid, and we could show both areas side by side just by clicking on the button that's grayed out. All right, so now we see both the live loops grid next to the tracks area, and we could show or hide both sections. Or you could use a series of helpful key commands like Option L to show the live loops grid, Option N to show the tracks area, Option B to show both, and Option V to flip between the two. We have a divider between the two areas, and we can adjust the boundary of either just by clicking, holding, and dragging. And of course, we could select individual cells and drag them into the tracks area to their corresponding track. But there's also a more performance-based way of recording your live loops launching into the tracks area. And honestly, it's a lot of fun to do. To get started, let's go ahead and enable this R button right above the live loops grid. This is the Enable Performance Recording button. With this button enabled, we can then press record and then start clicking on different cells and scenes to record these actions into the tracks area into a full-blown arrangement. So I'm going to disable the cycle range, start the playhead from bar 1. We have the count in enabled, and let's start recording some of these live loops in. Check it out. All these cells and scenes that I was launching in the live loops grid have been recorded into the tracks area. And upon stopping playback by pressing spacebar on my Mac's keyboard, we now have regions for the different parts in an arrangement. Now we can switch the focus from the live loops grid over to the tracks area just by clicking on these triangles in the divider. If I start up playback by pressing spacebar, or we can switch back to the live loops grid and we can start launching live loops. Or we can have some combination between the two. So maybe we want to focus on the tracks area, but I'd like to introduce perhaps some of the other ideas from the keyboard section. So I'll click on this divider button for the keyboard track lane to switch the focus back over to the live loops grid. And let's take a listen. And if we like an idea from the grid more, we could either just drag it right into the tracks or just set up to record again, get rid of these regions, and we can start recording. The versatility of the live loops grid for songwriting and producing cannot be overstated, regardless of the style of music. Thanks so much, and I'll see you for more in the next video in our Newbie to Ninja series. Take care.